Oh, goody.
All right, what is up, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we are back with another episode of Meta Monday. Enough time has passed here where we do have some kind of pretty decent data to look at, courtesy of HS Replay and the tracking that they do. Before we get into the data and all that stuff, though, we're just going to look over, a handful of the comps here. I think the total amount featured today are going to be 18 different comps. However, obviously we are limited to 9 decks here in Mercenaries, so I'm just going to go over basically comps I have here pretty briefly, and then we will get into the graph and data. But before we do that, if you enjoy the content, do remember to like and subscribe. It really does a whole ton to help out the channel and keep the Mercs videos coming. All right, so we're going to get into it here. Our first build here, I still think this is one of the strongest builds in the game right now. This is the Frost multi-opener. So if you've been playing, pretty much any Mercenaries PvP since the launch of Belinda and Localar, you know that Belinda, Varden, Valera is an incredibly strong comp. And in my opinion, this is probably the best version of it, purely due to its versatility and how you can open. So what I mean by that is this comp basically can open in so many different ways, it's ridiculous. If you're anticipating more mirrors, like other Belinda, Varden, Valera openers, you can swap in your Rag to kind of shut down their freezing and stuff. You can do Localar Frost leads against other Valera decks too to kind of punish their speed. There's just all these characters are really good and they all have very solid synergy with each other. So it's just honestly one of the best comps in the game, and I don't think that has really changed too much from the new characters being added in. But yeah, so we do have the lesser water elemental in Belinda, Chilling Amulet on Varden. Kind of an important distinction to make here. If you're opening with Belinda, Varden, Valera a whole lot, it can be better to run Band of Frost, but since this version of the build is kind of focused on opening in different ways, Chilling Amulet is just a better option, because that way, if your Varden does come in off the bench, you don't have to rely on the synergy from getting the freezes from Belinda's Elemental and stuff like that. So if you're switching up your opener a lot, Chilling Amulet is probably best, or if you're just running into a lot of like Rag openers and stuff like that shut down your freezes. But Band of Frost can also be incredibly powerful too. Then we have Valera. We all know at this point, not much needs to be said about Valera. She is the S tier character, and even with some interesting and pretty powerful counters printed, she still is probably the best character in the game, in my opinion. Doesn't mean you can't run stuff without her, but she's just really, really strong. Then Rag has seen a pretty big uptick in play due to the abundance of Frost comps running around. We are using the Sulfuris for that extra health, as well as denying the freezes, which are super duper important right now in the meta. So yeah, rag stocks have gone up quite a bit because of the prevalence of Frost, and we'll see more of that when we look at the data. Then Localar is just insane. He kind of slots into any comp, really, if you're trying to get some game against fast stuff, which is a lot of the meta right now. And Frost is also really popular in a bunch of different builds, so he just kind of synergizes incredibly well. Frigid Winds is honestly one of the most busted equipments in the game, for being real here. Like, the fact that you gain +4 frost damage every time, it enables some of the most ridiculous scaling we've ever seen. And if you compare that with some more frost attacks, like with Varden and stuff, it just gets out of hand. And then Jaina. Obviously, Jaina's just, one of the best frost units, because she does give you that frost scaling. She's very powerful and has that nice protection with Ice Block. Next up, we have GVT Shadow. This is one that I actually think there wasn't enough data on to make it into the graph, which really surprised me, because I am 100% of the opinion that this is like tied for the best GVT build, if not the best one overall. So obviously we know GVT by now, Valera, Grom, and Thrall as our kind of standard opener. But, I just talked about the importance of having, varied openers where you can swap things up depending on, especially if you know what your opponent is playing. And that's kind of the big strength of GVT Shadow, is because depending on what your opponent is playing, you can open with GVT or you can open with Shadow Valera. And both of those openers are just absurdly strong and powerful. One thing worth noting is sometimes it's worth running Eye of Shadow over Splinter of Nordrasil. And the main reason for that is because I think GVT can one-hit Local R if you're running that, if they do not have Loc maxed and with a cookie buff. I'm pretty sure that you can one-shot him, whereas if you have Splinter, it is kind of over 2 turns. So just one important thing to keep in mind, if you're seeing a lot of Local R, that might help you out a bit, as obviously this build is all focused around speed. But yeah, we do have Sinestra as our last slot here on the bench. And it's kind of nice because no matter if you lead GVT or Shadow Valera, Sinestra still feels rather strong coming in off the bench. And if you do have your Shadow units out, you do actually get a little bit of bonus speed here through Vol'jin for your Twilight Extinction. Usually it's not super relevant, but it is a nice little bonus. So yeah, this is, I personally think this is the best build of GVT right now just because of that flexibility. But we will see GVT Nature is still on this list, and I think is still technically the most popular variant of GVT. So we'll get to that a little bit later on. Then we have Surjak's Orc Nature build. So this one is actually going to be featured tomorrow in some gameplay I will have going up. This comp is really, really sweet. So basically, Surjak made this for King of the Hill a few nights ago, and he had a really good record with it. So I wanted to give it a shot, try it out on ladder, and I actually did pretty darn well with it. So obviously we all know what's up with Grom by now, just an incredible unit, but we're using him more for his kind of orc tag, and just because he can deal a ton of damage, especially when you scale him up. Staggering Slam is just such an important ability because it allows us to snipe down opposing water elementals even before they can get sped up by Valera. So that's really, really important because our other units are a little bit slower, so they are more susceptible to getting frozen, so that kind of helps shut that down before it can get out of hand. Then we have Galvangar. This unit has really, really impressed me. The only thing about Galvangar that is a little lacking is his health. He does have lower health than a lot of other fighters. You may notice I do not have mine maxed yet. I do think this is one of the characters where it is going to be more important to max him, as we are swinging in a lot with our characters, so we're taking more residual damage. And because of that, he's going to die faster even with our scaling, so that additional 5 HP can actually go a long way, because it's a pretty big difference between being above 70 health at the start and 66. Obviously, we do have Cookie on this, so he will start a little bit higher, but definitely one of those units I recommend trying to max if you can. But we are running the Fury of the Frost Wolf on him. This is a really, really strong passive. I've seen a few different people mess around with this. I know Dallas was trying to build this a little while ago, like him and Valera, and that +5 attack is like, it's actually a lot. Especially when you factor in we have other ways of boosting our attack, like Battle Fury here, or with Sorrowfang, where we are using our Serenite Stompers to give additional stats with buffing our damaged orcs. So that's kind of the game plan here, is we are just trying to buff up our orcs and kind of swing in with them, deal a lot of damage, and it seems to work pretty well. The other nice thing with Galvangar is Fatal Strike is, even though it's not a whole ton of damage, it can really shut down some of the stuff Sinestra enables in terms of her just healing and AoEing, and you not being able to kind of one-shot her down. So this comp in general has just felt very good against a lot of Sinestra builds because we have a unit in the front that can deal with her if she does swap in kind of earlier on, and we do have the full Nature backline here. And Nature seems to do a really good job against Sinestra, just because we can enable so much healing and scaling with our Nature units that even with her popping off for 60 damage on our blues every other turn, we can just out heal it. And we can scale to the point where we can just kill her in one turn. So standard stuff with the nature backline, lightning rod on Brucan, appetizers on Cookie, and life roof staff on the Malfurion. So nature has kind of fallen down on the popularity levels, but it is by no means not strong. Like, nature is still an incredible backline. It's just not as common as you used to see, because I think people are experimenting with different things and trying to have builds where they can have more flexible openers. And I think nature is one of those openers, or one of those compositions where you kind of want it to come in off the bench, as it's not quite as strong to lead with, especially with all the Valeras running around. 2 blues is kind of dangerous. So the only thing about this comp is you do pretty much have to stick to your standard opener and standard bench. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room for swapping things up, but the pure power level of it seems to just be good enough to make it worthwhile anyway. And then we have our first, and I think only dragon comp on the list for now. Dragons are still very much being figured out, so it is unsurprising to me that, there aren't a million builds of them, at least, over a certain threshold where the data can actually kind of tell us information, because we do want those bigger sample sizes to give us a better idea of what's going on here. However, I think the dragons are really strong. I also think there are some interesting builds you can do with Alexstrasza as well. But this is nature dragons, so basically we are using Yu'lon here with Pearl of Yu'lon to kind of protect our other 2 dragons in Sinestra and Longjin. So Yu'lon really is a lot better than I thought he was. Jade Gust is an incredibly powerful ability. It can deal just so much damage and absolutely destroys attackers. One pro tip for the mirror match here is you may notice that Sinestra, both these are cooldown 1, so she can only attack on turn 1. You do also get the bleed though, and the bleed is actually really big. Bleed 10, especially if you hit it on a caster, is really, really huge. We are using the mana brooch with her as well, because this is just, it was already insane when she was the only dragon being run, but now the fact that you can use this to heal up and protect your other dragons is just absolutely nuts. But one pro tip for the mirror match here is if you run into a dragon opener and you have a dragon opener, it actually makes sense to not attack with Sinestra, because Yu'lon can basically one-hit her if she attacks on turn 1. Since the damage gets doubled if they attacked, now it will get slightly reduced, usually because of Pearl of Yu'lon, but you just hit Sinestra with that and one other attack and she'll die on turn 1. So that's a little pro tip if you start running into some dragon mirror matches. And then Longjin, I mean, we really got exactly what we needed with dragons. I knew these characters were going to be good, but I think they've really overperformed my expectations. We are running Bottle of the Infinite Stars here to just, go with our dragon synergies and whatnot. It's a really good ability. Let's see, not that one. This one is also something you can consider, though. Sometimes it is really beneficial to have Among the Stars start off of cooldown. Can be very strong, and a lot of times I think your opponents are not going to check your item. Maybe as time goes on, that will kind of change. So the nature resistance can also be decent if you're starting to see more nature backlines and whatnot. Makes him kind of even harder to kill for them. But the main reason you would run this is for the Among the Stars starting off cooldown. Can be definitely relevant in some matchups, but because we're doing the dragon synergies, I think Bottle of the Infinite Stars is just really strong. And then we do have the nature backline here. Pretty much same stuff as always. The nice thing with the dragon comp is you can try a variety of stuff in this. You could throw CDC backline in here, you could throw fire, you could throw frost, you could really throw anything you want in there. However, the most popular, and so far at least looking like the most successful build that we have seen emerging so far, looking at the stats, has been the nature backline with the dragons. And here we have another build of Valeera Frost. This is actually, surprisingly, the most popular build of Valeera Frost going around right now. And this one does actually run the Band of Frost on the Varden as opposed to the Death Rattle a lot because they aren't really swapping their opener quite as much, as Sinestra's definitely more of a bench unit. Same kind of thing with Cookie. Localar you can swap up if you want, but I think you'd really need a good reason to. But yeah, so you've probably seen a lot of this comp going around. It actually really did surprise me that this is the most popular version of Valyria Frost, as I do think the version with Ragnaros and Jaina is a better version of the deck, just because of that versatility we talked about with your openers. But by no means is this a bad version of the deck. It's incredibly powerful. Valyria, Belinda, Varden can just actively shut down an incredible amount of strategies really fast, and the bench here, Cookie giving that additional health and snipes, Localar to kind of shut down fast strategies or, big greens that are hard to kill like Sinestra, and then just Sinestra to help deal with those blues and punish your opponent if you can kind of take out all their reds before she comes out. So definitely the most popular build of the Valyria, Belinda, Varden strategy. However, I'm not sure if it is the strongest of the bunch or not. Then we have one we talked about a little bit before, GVT Nature. So obviously this deck will not die. GVT, I almost view it as kind of the aggro deck of the format, where it just puts out so much damage on turn one that makes it just inherently powerful. And this is kind of the best old version of the build with the Nature backline. One important thing to note, you do want your Doomhammer on Thrall. It's funny, I accidentally queued a few games with the wrong equipment, and the deck is still so strong that you can win without it, but you definitely want that Doomhammer on Thrall for that extra damage. It is very, very helpful, especially against all the kind of Sinestras running around right now. But this one's pretty self-explanatory. You probably know how GVT works by now. And then Nature, again, even though it is less popular than it used to be, it is by no means weaker. It is still a very, very strong backline that I think we're going to see start to come back more in the coming weeks. And we have our first build with a CDC backline. So Frost CDC using Localar as one of the leads, combining with Jaina and Varden here. I think this one also generally runs the Death Rattle equipment on Varden. But yeah, full Frost lead. Frost is just probably the strongest tribe in the game right now, I would say. Fire's still good, dragons are good. There are a lot of good tribes, but Frost just has so much support, and pretty much all of it is good. Like, I can't really think of a Frost unit in the game that is bad right now. So anytime you have that many strong and powerful synergies, it is going to add up to a good comp, right? Kind of interesting to note, Karen Diablo Cookie is really fallen off in terms of popularity. It's slowly starting to kind of like seep its way back into the meta, but it's pretty funny to think about how this was the kind of number one bench as soon as we got Cookie, and it was dominant like that for a while, and now you very rarely see it. It's starting to come back a little bit, but once Nature bench became so popular, it definitely declined a bit, but it was still kind of 50-50 a lot of the time. Now I'd say I don't see Karen Diablo in like more than 20% of games or something, which if you told that to someone at launch, I don't think they would believe you because they were just the dominant backline and it wasn't particularly close. But now there's a lot more options, there's a lot more variety, so we're not seeing them quite as often. And we have a new take on Frost Tyrion. This one's pretty cool. No pun intended there, but the old build of Frost Tyrion used Jaina over Localar as the lead. Now we're replacing her with Localar and still using Varden. Again, this one I think does run with the Death Rattle equipment as well, and we are using Ashbringer to kind of buff up our bench. If you remember old Frost Tyrion, buffing Illidan, Diablo, and Karen off the bench is really, really strong, and that hasn't really changed. The big reason I think this comp has or just Frost Tyrion in general has fallen off a little bit is because it doesn't have a great defense against these freezing elementals. You might notice that none of these characters have taunt, and they're pretty much all acting rather slow outside of Judgment of Humility, which obviously you can't use on turn 1. So if Valyria is speeding up an elemental, they can just freeze your scary stuff like Localar, or if they're running Belinda without a Valyria, they can still have a chance to get that freeze off before you get one of your 5 speed skills done. So we do have the Illidan Diablo Karen bench. Have seen Illidan seeing a little bit more play recently. I'm still a big fan of Warglaves of Azeroth on him. This ability just really allows for some powerful stuff, especially in a meta where Sinestra is still very popular. And then Diablo and Karen just, really good together and really benefit highly from the bonus stats that Tyrion gives. And then the last comp we are going to see here is kind of an old classic. Seeing this one almost makes me nostalgic for the days of launch. We have Shadow Samuro CDC. So this lead has definitely, I think, gotten a little bit more popular due to the amount of Localars running around. This just gives a pretty nice way of dealing with Localar very quickly. Having those double blues to just focus them down. Even some of the rags that are going around, this can be pretty good against if you're seeing a lot of Ragnaros leads. So we do have Vol'jin with his Ring of Haste for the speed ups, Natalie with the Splinter of Nordrasil, and then Samuro with his Burning Blade to just kind of enable getting a lot bigger, a lot faster, and pretty much dominating any blue that happens to get run into by him. And Whirling Blade, I think, also has gotten a bit better now, because even though it's 5 speed, if you do get it off before a Localar attack, that can be pretty big, as if the Localar rolls, they can still hit into him, but they will deal no damage because he'll be immune. So kind of a fringe interaction, but I have seen it come up once or twice, so I thought it'd be worth mentioning. And then we do have the classic good stuff backline here with Karen Diablo Cookie. So yeah, it's just kind of older comp, but not a bad comp at all. And I think the way the meta has been shifting has been relatively favorable to it. So those are kind of the 9 comps I wanted to go over here in game. And now we are going to go and take a look at our graph using data from HS Replay to kind of get a feel for what the most popular comps are in the game right now. All right, so we have our data here that I put together, and there are a lot of different comps. So for this, I did only use comps that had either 500 or more games played. I did want to get a kind of bigger sample size so we can get a little bit more accurate data. I know win rates are something people are always curious about, so I figured it'd be worth mentioning. Pretty much every comp on here has a positive win rate. Generally, the range that I've seen is the lowest win rate comp is about 51%, and the highest is coming in at about 64-65%. Haven't seen any comps with this sample size higher than that yet. So pretty decent range, and kind of shows that pretty much all these comps can be used to climb pretty successfully. So at first glance, it really looks like a more varied meta, right? Like we can see there's nothing really dominating in terms of the bigger percentages here, right? The biggest percentage we have here is Frost Valyria, to probably nobody's surprise, at 10.1%, and that is the Belinda Valyria Varden build with Cookie, Locke, and Sinestra. That has a whopping 1,700 games, and yeah, 10.1% of the metagame. The thing about this chart is that if we actually look through it, and we will go over them all here, most of these comps are some different variation of Frost builds. More than half of the 18 comps listed here are rather Frost-focused builds, And it is also worth noting the time frame in which this data was gathered. So this data comes from between the patch release date from the 15th of this month, and I recorded it on the 27th. So it was just about 2 weeks of time, which I think was pretty good. I took a look at it after 1 week, but there really wasn't sufficient data to say anything very definitively. So that's why I kind of like waiting 2 weeks between these kind of meta reports, as it gives us more time to get more data and have probably a more clear picture of what is going on. So unsurprisingly, I don't think anyone is surprised by the fact that a Valera Frost Varden build is kind of the most popular comp, but it did surprise me that it was not the version with Ragnaros and instead is the one with Cookie and Sinestra. Next up, we have GVT Nature coming in at number 2, 9.5% of the metagame with 1,600 games. Again, it's kind of the aggro deck, right? And it doesn't require any new mercs. I think that is one thing that is important to remember, is just because a lot of the new mercs aren't showing up on here super quickly does not mean that they are bad or that they don't have any viable meta comps. A big part of that is for pretty much at least half of this time, half of these 2 weeks that we've been collecting the data, we haven't seen as much of these comps in at least that first week because everyone was grinding them up. And even if you're a hardcore dedicated grinder and are trying to get these characters up for PvP, it takes time. So I do think we will see more of these kind of new experimental comps with the new Mercenaries as time progresses, but for this meta report, there are not going to be quite as many of them. So the next one, third on our list here, is a Grom Belinda Valera build with Varden, Jaina, and Localar, coming in at 1,400 games and 8.3% of the metagame. This one's pretty interesting. I think we started to see more of this because I think this has pretty decent game against some of the Frost Valera comps. You can mess them up pretty hard because they only have one way of comboing their Valera. So if you have Grom on turn 1, you can mess up their combo, or you can opt to snipe down their elemental before it can get a freeze and start scaling the Varden up, setting up for a snap on turn 2. So I think that's the reason we have started to see a little bit more of this lead. I've ran into it a few times on ladder myself. And, you know, the Frost backline is generically good. Also enables potential switching up of strategies here, right? Because you don't have to lead with Grom. You could just throw Varden out there instead, and then you have your Varden Belinda Valera opener, which we all know is good. So, again, flexibility in openers, very powerful thing in the meta. Next we have, unsurprisingly, another Frost comp. So this is Localar Jaina Varden with a CDC backline, Karen Diablo Cookie, 1,300 games, coming at 7.7%. This one I haven't seen as much of myself, but doesn't really surprise me. Frost is really good. CDC still is pretty solid. I think it's one of those comps that people, you know, have just wanted to move away from for a while, and now that there are more options, everyone kind of knows how CDC plays by now, so I think people just want more variety in what they're playing, try out new things now that we have some more options, but doesn't mean CDC is bad, and it would not surprise me if it starts to kind of creep back into the meta more. And we have another Belinda Varden build. However, this one has Jaina as the third lead in place of Valera, which I thought was kind of interesting. Haven't really seen too much of this one myself. And then having the Cookie Localar Sinestra backline. Worth noting, this is very similar to the most popular comp, right? The only difference is Jaina in place of Valera. I think the Valera build is probably better, but we've talked about how strong Frost is, so it would not surprise me if this one is good as well. Coming in at 1,100 games and 6.5%. We have the kind of Frost Tyrion build I was talking about. This surprised me that there was so much of this. I did not expect this comp to be as popular as it is right now, so maybe it is kind of better than I thought, or maybe it's really good if you are able to dodge some of those Belinda Valera openers that can give it trouble. But yeah, local art Tyrion Varden with a Karen, Diablo, and Illidan bench, 1,000 games, just under 6% of the metagame. And we have our dragons coming in here with our Yulong Sinestra Longjin nature build, just under 1,000 games, coming in at 930 and 5.5% of the metagame share. I think there's a lot of potential with this build, and I think we are going to see a lot of experimentation with different backlines. I don't think you need to necessarily open with the dragons. With nature backline, you probably want to, because nature isn't quite as good of an opener. But I think kind of one of the strengths of the dragons is, depending on what your other 3 units are, you can swap out your backline and your front line interchangeably. Like maybe if you want to try out fire with it, or even just frost. Frost is a good opener, right? So I think it's pretty interesting that dragons do have a place here, and that it could be on, the leading units or the bench units, and both could still be strong. But so far, the one we've seen that has been most popular and most successful has been leading with the dragons and going into the nature comps afterwards. Next up, we do have the Shadow Samuro build with CDC. This one is coming in at 860 games and 5.1% of the metagame here. So this one, that's more than I thought it would be. It's actually higher up on this chart than I thought. And I think it's because of the prevalence of local R right now. And this comp does well against local R. And also on top of that, because of the presence of these Frost Valera elemental builds, it just seems rather strong to have this against Ragnaros, who has become much more popular due to the prevalence of the freezes running around. Then we have the Belinda, Valera, Varden, Jaina, Local R Sinestra build. This one is running the Varden Death Rattle, worth noting. I do think we have, we'll actually see it's listed again, 2 more down, but with a different item. And I do think the item actually matters a lot for these kind of builds, in terms of dictating how they end up playing out. However, this one is coming in at 850 games and 5% of the metagame. Then we have our one and only fire comp here. Belinda, Geddon, Ragnaros, Cookie, Local R, and Sinestra. 800 games, 4.7% metagame share. I think fire really isn't in a bad place. It's just there's not quite as much variety with it right now. If you want to go fire, Belinda, Geddon, and Rag are all incredible units. So I think, it just makes sense to run them. But I don't know if there are more alternate fire builds out there. And again, we see that Cookie, Local R, Sinestra bench. It's showing up quite a lot. So it seems to be kind of one of the new, more popular benches coming out that seems to work in a lot of different comps, kind of like CDC and Nature before it. Then we have the Belinda, Valera, Varden build. However, this one is running the Frost scaling ability on Varden, and then the Jaina, Local R, Ragnaros bench. So this actually does have a slightly different bench. I really like Rag right now. The fact that you can just lead with a Rag when you're expecting Frost, or if you run into an opponent you've faced before and they're Frost, really shuts down their strategy pretty hard some of the time, especially if they are running the Frost scaling item on Varden. So I like the kind of flexibility there. That one's coming in at 790 games, 4.7% of the meta. Then we have another Tyrion build. This one's pretty interesting. I believe, it is the same as the previous Tyrion build that we saw. Actually, no, it does not. It doesn't run Local R. So, and it does run the Varden Death Rattle, because there's less freezing synergy without Belinda and such. But so this is kind of the old Frost Tyrion, right? Tyrion, Jaina, Varden with Karen, Diablo, and Illidan. It's not a bad comp. I think it still has game against a lot of the field, but its matchup against Frost, Belinda, Varden really hurts. So I think that is kind of what's keeping it down a little bit. However, don't underestimate comps like this, right? Like, some people either don't have the time or the desire to grind up a lot of these new mercenaries fast, so there's nothing wrong with sticking with an older comp if it's working for you. And this one comes in at 750 games and 4.5% in the meta. And then we have Belinda, Valera, and Eudora with a Localar, Vol'jin, Sylvanas bench. This one's really cool. I've only seen this once or twice, but Eudora does seem to be coming back into the meta a bit. I've seen her actually paired with Ragnaros quite a bit for some like interesting anti-frost strategies. I think the reason for that is because the cannons kind of make it harder for Valera to target stuff, and then we have Rag there to shut down their cold snaps on us, right? Because that is obviously the thing we are most scared about from Varden, is getting snapped, especially on turn 2, or at speed 2 rather. And that's pretty dangerous. And then we do have the Sylvanas in the back to kind of benefit off the fact that Eudora's cannons are dying and giving us more fodder to buff the Sylvanas in the late game. Haven't seen Sylvanas in a while, so pretty happy to see her show up in at least one comp on here. And this one's coming in at 710 games and 4.2% of the meta. And then we're getting close to the end here. We got 5 comps left. This one is the Localar Jaina Varden build, so kind of opening with a full Frost, no Valera or anything like that. And then off the bench, we do have Belinda, Sinestra, and Alex Straza. So this is, I think, the only build we have seen Alex show up in so far. I've tested her a bit in Dragons, and I think she can definitely be good there. But those builds are probably going to require some more testing and refining. Cool to see her show up nonetheless, though. I do enjoy seeing that. Obviously, Frost is very, very strong, and we do have a little bit of flexibility in the opener. You could always open with your Dragons or with Belinda in place of one of your other units. It's pretty interesting, but this isn't one I have seen myself on the ladder yet, so I don't know too much about it. But it is coming in at 700 games and 4.2% of the meta. And we have the Shadow Valera build with the CDC backline. Again, just really strong. One of the things I was really surprised about is that the Shadow GVT build didn't seem to actually show up anywhere on here. So I think that build is actually criminally underplayed right now, and I think it actually has more game than this version of the build with the CDC backline. Not to say CDC is bad, I just really emphasize that having flexible openers is very important in the metagame right now, and I think it just makes for an overall better comp. But Shadow Valera is an incredibly strong opener. We see it coming in at 680 games and 4% of the meta. We have Belinda, Valera, Varden, Jaina, Localar, Sinestra. This one is running the scaling with Varden over the Death Rattle. Pretty solid comp, more Frost focused as we can see, but Sinestra still kind of sneaking her way in there because she's just so individually powerful, even without the aid of other dragons. This one's coming in at 660 games, just under 4% of the meta. And then we do have 2 more here that are a little bit left off the graph due to space, but I will talk about them here quickly. We have Localar Jaina Varden with the Death Rattle and the Nature backline. Again, Frost comps really powerful. Not surprised to see, just a ton of them everywhere. This one is coming in at, I believe, 550 games and is representing just over 3% of the meta. And then last but not least, we do have one more Eudora comp, which, again, really love to see. It is Tyrion, Eudora, Ragnaros with Vol'jin, Thrall, and Sylvanas. This is a really neat build. I think there's a lot of potential with this. It just is not hugely tested yet. But Tyrion giving some pretty big buffs to especially Thrall and Sylvanas is pretty nice. That Eudora Rag combo, like I mentioned before, seems to do pretty decent against Frost from what I've heard, and shutting them down a little bit. Vol'jin still seems like a little bit of an odd man out to me for this version. However, I do think he is still a powerful kind of revenge killer as your first swap in off the bench, so that might be one of the reasons. Another one is obviously this comp is lacking blues, right? Vol'jin is the only blue, So I do think you need your one blue to be powerful and speedy, and Vol'jin definitely does both of those things. Thrall off the bench definitely had some tech against all the Sinestras running around in the metagame, as we do see her in a ton of comps right now. And then Sylve to kind of just go with that Eudora summoning strategy to build her up in the late game. This one is coming in at exactly 500 games and 3% of the meta. So 18 different comps here, a lot of different comps. Like I said at the beginning of looking at this data, it looks like a lot of variety, and there is a fair amount of variety, but it is pretty astounding how many of these comps are Frost focused in one way or the other. I do think this will change over time, but I think Frost just got such insanely powerful units 2 releases ago between Belinda and Localar that, I mean, Frost was already good, right? Between Jaina and Varden were already very powerful together, so the fact that we got 2 more like A-tier Frost units just definitely pushed them a bit over the edge, I think. So I think other strategies will eventually get to that point, but they're going to need a little bit more support. For instance, some strategies haven't really gotten any support since release. If we're thinking about stuff like Murlocs or Fel, Demons, there's a lot of different strategies that could be getting more support and probably will get more support over time. So I think that is one of the reasons that Frost is just such a dominant part of the meta right now. However, as time goes on and people try new stuff, I do think we are going to see some more of the new characters making it in. I think we're going to see more dragon builds without a doubt. Chi-Ji might be good enough too. It's kind of hard to say right now because we don't have access to his best ability, as it is kind of time-gated behind some new bounties, which not really a big fan of that strategy, but we'll be able to unlock his equipment and max him in about a week's time. So we'll have to see on that, and I do think there could be some potential with beasts as well. Haven't seen many people experimenting with Nuzao a whole lot, but people have been trying Zwen quite a bit, and even though I don't think they're quite enough on their own to fully bring beasts back into the meta, they're far from bad characters, so I think we'll just have to wait and see how that kind of pans out, and if there are any other beasts we get in like the next drop to give them a little bit more help. But that is going to be it for this episode of Meta Monday. If you enjoyed it, do remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel a whole ton, and I really appreciate it. But thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.